Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Vladimir Putin is playing his favorite game again. Poker face diplomacy, promising peace to Washington while reassuring Russian elites of the opposite. One morning in March, he told oligarchs the war is here to stay. And hours later, he assured Donald Trump over the phone of his eagerness to negotiate peace. Now, this double messaging makes me curious. Is Putin simply bluffing his way through another round of geopolitical poker? Tonight, we're diving deep into Putin's playbook to see who's actually holding all the cards. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia has not ceased in its attacks against Ukrainian civilian targets or the country's infrastructure. As it refuses to either accept or outright reject the American ceasefire proposal, Moscow has shown no signs that it is inclined to stop the war. Ukrainian forces are doing all that they can to prevent these Russian strikes from reaching their targets. Nonetheless, these efforts fail sometimes. Given that Russia has reportedly attacked Ukrainian energy facilities, President Zelensky has called on the US to impose harsher measures against Moscow.
Ukraine suffers today. Ukrainian people suffer. Therefore, we are eagerly awaiting serious demonstrations of sanctions measures, at least sanctions measures from America.
One area the US could target to hurt Russia are its oil exports. Oil, along with gas, is one of the most important ways for Moscow to fund its war machine. An American crackdown on oil could, some observers say, make Russia reconsider its current stance on the ceasefire. The stalling tactics that Russia seems to be using toward American efforts to reach a peace deal have a real cost. This one is measured in human lives. In the lives of Ukrainian defenders and innocent civilians who, more than perhaps anyone, would finally wish to see an end to the conflict on fair terms.
Now, let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Despite the Trump administration's insistence on reaching a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, Moscow has not been forthcoming in the slightest. The Kremlin has now fallen back on its narrative about alleged extremist nationalists in Ukraine to continue the war.
When news of a ceasefire proposal first broke, the Kremlin responded by saying it would agree only if certain conditions were met. These included essentially incapacitating Ukraine's defense capabilities, which means that the conditions were unacceptable to Kiev. The White House has expressed its frustration with Russia refusing to agree to the ceasefire, and now Moscow has returned to one of its most prevalent narratives about the war: the alleged presence of extremist nationalists in Ukraine and the need to denazify the country. Many observers are pointing out that Russia is most likely stalling, as it has not outright rejected the ceasefire proposal. There have also been reports that Moscow is gearing up for a new major offensive within the next few months, and Russian forces have also been making more of a push to capture territory. Experts point out that Russia most likely wants to hold as much Ukrainian territory as it can, especially in the regions it has illegally annexed, before it comes to the negotiating table. This includes pushing Ukrainian forces fully out of the Kursk region, as Kiev's presence in the area poses a threat to Moscow's position in any peace talks.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, let me tell you about one busy day that Vladimir Putin had last month. He spent the morning reassuring Russia's elite businessmen that sanctions from the West are actually fueling economic growth, which, if true, would make the current sanctions regime the Russian equivalent of the super mushroom for Mario. And that's significant because just an hour later, he was promising Donald Trump exactly the opposite. In fact, Putin told the gathered Russian businessmen, don't expect this war to end quickly. Translation? Buckle up, because Putin's in it for the long haul, treating peace negotiations like a card game that he has no intention of folding in. Now, Putin's carefully crafted narrative, leaked conveniently to state-friendly media, is that sanctions are not only manageable, but beneficial. But the Kremlin never lets damaging information slip out accidentally. If something leaks, it's precisely because Putin wants you to hear it. Yet there is an inconsistency in Russia's narrative. On the one hand, Putin brags to his domestic audience about thriving under sanctions. On the other, Russian negotiators tell Americans that ending sanctions is a precondition for any peace deal. Putin's strategy is simple: tell everyone exactly what they want to hear and hope no one compares notes. And Russia's end goal hasn't changed since day one of this war. Putin is still hell-bent on controlling Ukraine, crushing its military, and stripping it of sovereignty, ideally while getting the United States to concede piece by piece. Ukraine's reportedly willing to accept a bitter compromise, freezing the conflict at current front lines, effectively ceding about 20% of its territory without formally surrendering any land. Now, they're even prepared to drop their NATO aspirations if they receive solid security guarantees. It's a realistic, albeit painful concession, but for Putin, even that is not enough. For Russia, any deal that doesn't humiliate Ukraine or dismantle Western sanctions is unacceptable. The most likely scenario is unfortunately a stalemate. Lots of photo ops, handshakes, and dramatic tweets, but no real peace. That is because Vladimir Putin's playbook was never about peace, but about appearances and leverage. And every day these negotiations drag on without resolution is another day that he scored points domestically, reinforcing the myth of Russia's resilience and Western weakness. So to sum this up, if Vladimir Putin has any say in it, bombs and drones are not going to stop flying over Ukraine anytime soon. His strategy is unrelenting, goals unwavering maximalist, and if immediate victory is not feasible, he will continue grinding his forces into dust in this bloody war of attrition. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nielsen, a lecturer from the University College London. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, good to be here.
So today we're trying to examine what's Russia's endgame when it comes to this peace negotiation process and what kind of geopolitical game are they just playing. I think it's been very clear to the Trump administration at this point that while we have seen the mask peeling off, that Russia doesn't really want to achieve peace, but how long can they play this and what are some of the cards that they still hold?
Well, Russia still has some material assets remaining. They still have quite a large population, of course. They've still got military assets, so they can keep this going for quite a while. You asked to begin with, what is Russia's endgame here? As far as I can see, as things stand, Russia's endgame is to continue. If we're talking about Russia and potential peace in Ukraine, I would say that Russia is currently not looking for peace in Ukraine. It's intent to continuing the war. It's intent to continuing the process of engaging with the Americans, certainly, over Ukraine, but not with the aim of ending hostilities.
All right, the way that I'm observing how Russia is dealing with this peace negotiation is kind of like me in a buffet. They pick out the things that they like and then leave things that they don't like behind. So right now it does seem like they are only agreeing to things that are more beneficial to them. Do you think at some point the Americans will start putting more pressure on them, and how do you think Russia will then have to respond to that?
I think that if the Americans were to put significant pressure on the Russians would have to respond. However, I do not see any signs that the American administration is willing to put significant pressure on the Russians. I know that Trump, American President Donald Trump, a few days back talked about how he was dissatisfied with the Russian actions. That is, I would say, cheap talk. The Americans have shown no willingness whatsoever under Donald Trump to put pressure on the Russians, and the Russians know this. So while, yes, the Americans would certainly be able to, for instance, increase sanctions on the Russians or otherwise make life quite difficult for the Russian regime, that is simply not anything we can see happening now or should expect to see in the foreseeable future.
And like you said, the Russians' plan right now does seem to be like dragging this out for as long as possible. But how is their economy sustaining, and how is it when it comes to their domestic views? We have seen that the Russians are trying to play it off as if this thing doesn't hurt their economy. But the real life, of course, tells a very different story. Is that sustainable?
Well, there are certainly economic problems in Russia, and as I've said before in this program and elsewhere, the Russian economy was not necessarily going very well before the full-scale invasion started a few years back. Right. The Russian economy has been mismanaged by the regime for many years now. Having said that, however, what you got to understand about the Russian regime as it is now is that the Russian regime is in the business of war and arguably, if you like, in the business of death. It is in the business of continuing this military engagement and military engagements more generally, because that is, apart from being central to the Russian identity as we see it now, it is also central to the business fortunes of a lot of people connected to the Russian top. lots of people among the Russian elites now have investments connected to the war, have investments connected to Russian defense expenditure and so on. So those people need for this sort of military engagement to continue. We should also be aware that although the Russian economy does have some problems, certainly, and the war is exacerbating those problems, the war has also helped to some extent redistribute funds within Russia to a number of towns and areas which are filled with, if you like, blue-collar workers working in the defense industry. And although, of course, again, yes, in the long term, in 5-10 years, this is not sustainable, right now, continuing the war helps the Russian regime to send at least some money out to, if you like, working class areas with people who can therefore be expected to support the regime. And that is in Vladimir Putin's immediate interest.
Right, so like you've made a very good point about why they want to keep this thing going. And when it comes to the West, be it United States, be it Europe, are there any ways to tackle some of those incentives to make sure that at least they do have some sort of will to come into a negotiation?
Well, again, as I said before, if America were to be serious about wanting to push Russia to a settlement, then America could, of course, put much more pressure, say, in terms of sanctions and so on Russia. That does not seem to be happening, and frankly, I would not expect the Trump administration to do so. If, however, we're looking at what Europe can be doing, Europe can certainly increase its own pressure on Russia, both in terms of sanctions, but also in terms of its own military expenditure, to make clear to Russia and to America, and most importantly to Ukraine, that Europe is with Ukraine for the long haul. I would also point out, if you've looked in recent days, actually in recent weeks, but it's been this tendency has increased over the last 24 hours or so, you can see some rapprochement, you can see some emerging increasing connections between Europe and China. Now, don't get me wrong, China is not about to abandon Russia, and China has to some extent funded Russian military action in Ukraine. On the other hand, China is now very keen that Europe remains part of the process to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and China is also very aware if an increasing trade war is happening with America. China is also very aware that it needs to find extra friends within Europe, that it needs to align more with Europe on a number of trade issues, arguably against America, but also indirectly perhaps against Russian interests. And in that context, I would keep a very close eye on the potential for emerging joint economic interests between China and Europe. That might then spill over into increased Chinese interest in finishing the conflict in Ukraine in a way that is not to Russia's advantage.
All right, now there's some argument that Trump might be cozying up to Russia because they want to, counteract China's influence, and it's like a big three-way struggle between world powers. And with what you just told me, do you think that there is a world where the United States align with Russia and the European Union starts aligning with China and become some sort of weird Frankensteinian kind of power struggle?
Not completely. I mean, I can see the logic why people might look at that pattern. I don't think it'll be as simple as that, because, as I said, China will continue to have connections to Russia and vice versa. And I don't still see Donald Trump conducting a policy coherent enough to become a reliable ally for Russia. I would point out, though, that because of other interests, and again I go back to the economic joint interests of Europe and China, for instance, it may become so in the specifics of the Ukraine conflict that China and Europe will have a joint interest in ending or at least pausing that conflict on terms reasonably favorable to Ukraine, and therefore we can start seeing a de facto collaboration between Europe and China on that issue. But again, on a number of other issues, for instance, in terms of authoritarian ideology versus liberal democracy, China remains much closer to Russia and arguably to the America that is developing, much closer to them than it is to Europe. So while China can certainly become, for specific incidents, such as specific trade policies, or indeed in the case of Ukraine, China could become a temporary ally of Europe. I think longer-term collaboration and alliances between China and Europe are still difficult to see. And in terms of alliances between Trump's America and any other state, be that Russia or wherever, as we've seen with the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu to America again now, any potential allies of America will have to deal with the fact that Donald Trump is very inconsistent in a number of his policies and frankly unreliable to anybody who thinks that he's an ally. Nobody can basically trust what his administration will do in the medium to longer term. And I certainly don't think either Russia or anybody else is willing to put their security and their long-term prosperity on an alliance with him.
Right, so we're looking down at the uncertainty that is the current U.S. administration, as well as perhaps a slight realignment of geopolitical interests, at least economically. How would you assess Russia's capabilities right now in maneuvering with all these kind of nuances? And do you think that they are indeed playing the cards well?
I don't think they're necessarily playing them that well. They're playing what they can, which is what they've done for years. The big problem for Russia is that they are, and have been for some years now, a regional power, trying again and again to show themselves as a global power. And they simply do not have the capacity to be a global power anymore. So in the emerging conflicts between China and America, and arguably Europe, Russia is simply not at that level in terms of its material assets. That also means that Russia constantly has to fight fires all around, sometimes literal fires, sometimes metaphorical ones, all around its borders in order to try and retain some level of influence. So if you look, for instance, at the post-Soviet space, you can see Russia again and again being in a reactive state rather than an active state. And this sort of repeats across the world. So while you can expect Russia to continue to talk a good game, if you see what I mean, in terms of talking about its negotiations with Trump and others about sorting the world's ills, in reality, if you're looking at the longer term issues in terms of international, the global trade regime, in terms of global security, so on and so forth, you are going to see a Russia that will fall further and further behind the leading powers of the world, again, notably China, Europe, and despite all the problems Trump is posing to America, also, of course, America as a leading power. Russia simply can't be at that level. And what you will also start seeing, and you're already seeing it to some extent, is increased problems with domestic governance in Russia. So what you will see more and more is that the Kremlin will, for instance, find it more and more difficult to control, or even willingness to control, what's happening in individual regions. Look at the North Caucasus. In the North Caucasus, you have a number of Russian republics that are barely controlled by the Kremlin anymore, Chechnya being the clearest example thereof. And if any sort of local unrest was to break out there again, which it certainly could, then I see the Kremlin being relatively limited in its ability to handle it. Look at what happened in Kursk. Look at what happened elsewhere along in the Russian provinces along the Ukrainian border. The Russian regime is becoming very slow at reacting to some of the issues there because it is losing the capacity for domestic governance. So it can talk a good game, it can keep itself to some extent relevant in international politics, but it simply does not have the assets to engage fully with countries at the level of countries like China and the US, or organizations like the EU.
All right, so we'll have to see how this shapes out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your expert analysis. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The Ukrainian army has been adapting its drones in a technological escalation. Kyiv sources are now installing malware in their drones so that they serve as Trojan horses to expose Russian operators once captured.
According to Forbes, Russian troops have discovered that captured Ukrainian drones are now carrying malware which performs various disruptive functions. These include burning USB ports, preventing so-called reflashing, and revealing drone operator locations. These measures also prevent the Russians from analyzing captured Ukrainian drones to develop countermeasures. It also severely limits Moscow's ability to repurpose Ukrainian equipment. This new technological adaptation shows how Ukraine has been leveraging its IT industry to counter Russia's growing military tech sector. This discovery is also expected to trigger some sort of technological arms race between Ukraine and Russia and take the rivalry in drone warfare tactics to the next level. Amid these changes, there have also been reports that Russian territorial gains have reached a 5-month low. The reported success of Ukrainian counterattacks seems to have brought the Russian advance to almost a halt.
Romanian presidential candidate and former Prime Minister Victor Ponta has promised to end Ukrainian grain exports through Romania once elected. However, he maintains that he would continue to support Ukraine in other ways.
Ponta says he wants to ban the export of Ukrainian grain through Romania's Black Sea ports to protect the country's farmers. Bucharest has had a vital role when it comes to exporting the grain, shipping around 29 million tons through its facilities. In 2024, Romanian farmers asked the government to support import limits on Ukrainian agricultural products, claiming that a free trade agreement with Kiev for grain will lead to unfair competition and put domestic production at risk. Ponta does, however, want to continue supporting Ukraine through different means. These include continued arms shipments and further training for Ukrainian pilots. He has also assured that Romania could defend Moldova in the case of Russian attack, but would not do so for Ukraine, and expressed support for what he called radical change in the United States under Donald Trump.
Economic experts from Central Asia and the Caucasus believe that the impact the new U.S. tariffs will have on the region's nations will be limited. There are, however, concerns about unforeseen consequences arising from an all-out global trade war.
The announcement of Washington's new tariff policy comes at a time when Central Asian countries are beginning to pursue cooperation to improve regional trade. The latest policy has raised some eyebrows in the region, as the US had also recently expressed interest in expanding trade with Central Asian nations and in heavily investing in the area. Observers point out that given such mixed signals, some of these countries may think twice about stepping away from the trade relationships with China and Russia. The impact these tariffs will have also varies depending on the country. Each Central Asian and Caucasian country has been hit with a 10% tariff, except Kazakhstan, which has been slapped with a 27% tariff. The Kazakh Trade Ministry says, however, that its US-bound exports are mostly made up of crude, oil, uranium and silver, which are exempt from the tariffs.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.